The desert evening carried a heat that clung to the ground like an old memory, shimmering in waves over the broken ridges and the silent mesas. An Apache helicopter had been forced down hours earlier, its metal belly torn open by mechanical failure after a long patrol across the borderlands. Its pilot, Captain Richard Hale, had limped the machine into a dry ravine and barely managed to kill the engines before it gave its last groan of power. He stumbled out with his helmet under one arm, dust coating his uniform, adrenaline still pulsing but his throat bone-dry from the desert wind. He was trained for emergencies, but nothing in his handbook told him what to do when the nearest base was 2 days' march through wilderness and the sun was already bleeding toward the horizon. For hours he struggled through dry brush and sharp stone, every muscle in his legs aching under the weight of his gear, until finally he came upon something strange, almost out of place. A crooked wooden fence, a dirt trail, and the faint outline of smoke curling above a clay brick home tucked at the edge of a canyon wall. He thought it was a mirage at first, but the closer he drew the clearer it became. Someone lived here, far from the towns and highways, someone who chose the silence of the desert as company. He raised a cautious hand to knock at the weathered door, but it opened before his knuckles could touch it. A woman stood there, older than him yet not frail, her dark hair streaked with silver, her face weathered by sun but steady as stone. She said nothing at first, only looked at him with an expression that was neither surprised nor afraid, as if she had been expecting him all along. Then she gestured for him to come inside, her voice low and calm, telling him in plain words that he must be tired and hurt. He hesitated, a soldier trained to question every unknown, but something in her manner disarmed him, stripped him of suspicion. He stepped inside and found himself surrounded by the scent of herbs drying from the rafters, clay jars filled with roots and powders, a single wooden table and a narrow bed along the wall. The place was modest, almost austere, yet there was a kind of strength in its simplicity. He lowered his pack, removed his helmet, and let the silence swallow him while the woman fetched a bowl of water and a strip of cloth. She moved with a deliberate grace, not hurried, not hesitant, only certain of what needed to be done. She sat him down and began tending to a gash on his forearm that he had barely noticed, the sting of the cloth sharp but clean. He found himself staring at her hands, steady as she worked, her fingers worn from years of labor yet delicate in their care. She said little, only asked his name and gave hers in return, Maria. She told him she lived alone, that the desert was both harsh and kind if one knew how to listen to it. He asked her why she stayed so far from everything, but she did not answer directly. She only smiled faintly and said that the land held her roots. Hours passed as she patched his wound and gave him a meal of beans and cornbread, plain yet filling, and as night folded over the canyon, he felt something he had not known in years, the quiet comfort of being looked after without question, without demand. Yet it was not the food, nor the water, nor even the shelter that unsettled him most, but a small detail he almost overlooked at first. As she reached for a bundle of cloth on a shelf, her sleeve shifted, and a patch stitched to her faded shirt caught the flicker of the firelight. His breath stopped. The insignia was unmistakable, the same unit patch he wore on his own uniform, the emblem of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, his regiment, his brothers. It was old, worn and frayed at the edges, but it was real. His pulse thundered in his ears as he stared, and Maria, noticing his frozen gaze, looked down at her arm and then back at him with eyes that suddenly carried the weight of untold years. For the first time since he arrived, the air in the room grew heavy, charged with something deeper than chance. He could not speak, the words tangled in his throat. How could a solitary woman, living miles from civilization, wear the patch of his secretive regiment? What history lay hidden in her silence? Maria placed the bundle of cloth down, sat across from him, and folded her hands, her face unreadable. "You've seen it," she said softly, her voice no longer the simple tone of a desert hermit but carrying a gravity that made his chest tighten. "Then you know we are not strangers." Captain Richard Hale's mind refused to accept what his eyes told him, and yet the firelight illuminated every frayed thread of the patch on Maria's sleeve with undeniable truth. The emblem was no coincidence, no decorative scrap scavenged from some forgotten supply crate. It was the same insignia he had saluted under, bled for, and sworn to defend. He shifted in his seat, his soldier's instinct fighting against the fatigue in his bones, his thoughts circling in disbelief. How do you have that?" he asked finally, his voice hoarse, breaking the taut silence. Maria did not rush to answer. She sat still for a long moment, the flames of the small fire reflecting in her eyes, until she drew a slow breath and began to speak, not with the clipped directness she had shown before but with the rhythm of someone unspooling a memory buried too long. She told him she had once worn that patch herself long ago, when the world seemed to burn with constant conflict and the desert sky was never free from the thunder of rotors. She had been young then, younger than she looked now, trained in the art of keeping men alive when their machines betrayed them, a combat medic assigned to the very regiment he now called his family. Richard could hardly reconcile the woman before him. Plain clothes, weathered hands, a simple clay brick home, with the image of a battlefield medic running through dust and gunfire. He listened as she described the roar of Apaches descending into hostile valleys, the nights of triaging wounded men with little more than her wits and a half-empty bag of supplies, the way she had stitched skin under the glare of red lights inside cramped cabins while bullets rattled the fuselage outside. Every word she spoke tightened something inside him. It was not just her story but the echo of his own. He had lived parts of it himself, felt the same adrenaline, the same sick weight of responsibility. "But you're not in the records," he whispered, thinking aloud. "I've studied the names, the rosters. I'd have known." Maria gave a small, almost sad smile. "You wouldn't have. Women like me weren't written in the same ink. I was there, but the paper erased me the moment I left." She explained that after years of service, after carrying men bleeding on her shoulders and surviving crashes that turned steel into twisted wreckage, she had walked away, not dishonorably, not by force but by her own will. The regiment had consumed her youth, and when she returned stateside, the silence of civilian life felt foreign, unbearable. She sought refuge in the desert, where the land's cruelty matched her scars but its solitude gave her peace. Richard sat stunned, caught between awe and unease. The idea that this simple woman, this hermit of the canyon, had once walked the same battlefields and carried the same creed made the hair on his arms rise. He asked questions, dozens of them, his curiosity overcoming his caution. Who had she known? What missions had she flown? What battles had she survived? Maria answered with a clarity that left no doubt she spoke truth. Names of commanders long retired, call signs etched into memory, even the slang of mechanics and crew chiefs that no outsider could mimic. Still, he could not understand why she had chosen to vanish completely, to bury her life beneath dust and silence. She saw the struggle in his eyes and leaned closer, her voice soft but firm. "You think the patch is just cloth, Captain, but for me it became a weight. Every time I saw it, I remembered the faces of those I couldn't save. Out here, I don't have to see it, except tonight, when fate decided to bring you to my door." He lowered his gaze, suddenly feeling the burden of his own uniform pressing heavier on his shoulders. He too carried ghosts he rarely admitted, names of comrades who had not walked away. He wondered if this was what his future might look like. A retreat into solitude, a life stripped of noise and rank, surrounded only by memory. The fire cracked between them, and outside the coyotes sang in the dark. Richard realized that in the span of a few hours, his mission had shifted. No longer was survival his only concern. He was staring into the mirror of a destiny he hadn't imagined, embodied in this woman who had lived his path and then abandoned it. Yet even as his chest tightened with empathy, there was another layer he couldn't ignore. Maria's presence in this canyon wasn't random. She had supplies, dried herbs that cured more than hunger, jars that smelled faintly of antiseptic concoctions no civilian would know. The bed in the corner wasn't just for her. It looked prepared for emergencies, as though she still expected wounded men to stagger through her door. And that patch, though she claimed to have left her service behind, was not discarded but sewn deliberately onto her sleeve, as if some part of her refused to let go. "Why show me this?" he asked finally, his voice low. "If you want it to disappear, why keep the symbol at all?" Maria's gaze hardened slightly, not unkind but resolute. "Because some truths should never be erased completely. The world forgets too quickly. I may live simply, but I will not allow my years, or the blood spilled beside me, to vanish into dust." Her words struck him like rotor wash, knocking the breath from his lungs. He saw then that her simplicity was not retreat but defiance, her solitude not weakness but a choice made with unflinching will. And as that realization sank in, another truth began to stir in the back of his mind. The helicopter he had abandoned in the ravine, its systems dead, its communications useless, was not beyond her knowledge. If anyone could help him bring it back to life, to coax its heart beating again, it was the woman who had spent half her years beneath their blades. But to ask her meant pulling her back into the world she had walked away from. He studied her across the fire, torn between need and respect, between his duty and the sanctuary she had built. Maria seemed to read his hesitation before he voiced it. She rose slowly, walked to the shelf, and retrieved a small, battered case of tools that had no business being in a hermit's home. She placed it gently on the table, her eyes never leaving his. "Sleep tonight, Captain," she said softly. "Tomorrow we'll see what the desert still remembers." Dawn in the desert was a strange kind of awakening, not gentle but sharp, as if the earth itself cracked open under the first spear of sunlight. Captain Richard Hale rose from the narrow bed Maria had offered him, his body still aching from exhaustion, though the quiet night in her adobe home had given him more rest than he'd expected. The smell of smoke and coffee brewed over a clay stove greeted him, mingling with the earthy scent of sage she had burned before sunrise. She moved about with the same quiet certainty as before, her hands practiced, her posture balanced, not wasting a single gesture. When she set the mug before him, steaming and bitter, she gave no instructions and no questions. She only looked at him as though measuring how ready he was to face the day. Richard drank in silence, his mind turning over the strange gravity of her revelations the night before. He couldn't shake the image of that patch stitched on her sleeve, nor the weight of her voice when she had spoken of forgotten names and erased histories. She was not just a hermit, not just a healer, she was one of them, one of the ghosts hidden in the regiment's unspoken chapters. And now, somehow, their paths had collided in this canyon, drawn together by the failure of a machine and the persistence of fate. When they stepped outside, the air was crisp and the desert stretched endlessly, painted in pale gold. Richard slung his gear onto his shoulders and felt the soldier's instinct return, calm focus sharpening as he oriented himself toward the ravine where his Apache lay broken. Maria carried the small battered tool case in one hand, as though it weighed nothing, and a satchel slung across her back. He wanted to ask her why she had kept it all these years, why she hadn't buried the last pieces of her military life along with the rest of her past, but the silence between them was more commanding than words. They walked for nearly an hour, their boots crunching over gravel and hardpan, the rising sun heating their necks, the land around them alive with quiet danger, rattlesnakes shifting in the brush, hawks tracing lazy circles in the sky. When they reached the ravine, Richard felt his chest tighten at the sight of the Apache resting like a wounded beast, its rotor blades still, its fuselage scored with scratches from its forced landing. To him it was more than a machine. It was his lifeline, his duty, his home in the sky. Seeing it silent, lifeless, was like staring at the body of a fallen comrade. Maria stood at the edge of the ravine and studied it with an expression that startled him, nostalgia mingled with sorrow. She descended the slope carefully, her steps sure, and placed her hand on the cool metal skin as though greeting an old friend. "She still has a heart," she murmured almost to herself, then glanced back at him. "But you starved it. The desert takes what isn't guarded." Richard climbed down after her, his boots scraping rock, his own hands brushing the dust from the Apache's panels. He had done a cursory check before leaving it the day before, but his fatigue and the fading light had limited him. Now with her by his side he saw the craft anew. She moved with startling familiarity, running her fingers along seams, opening access panels, inspecting components with the same practiced eye he had seen in seasoned crew chiefs. "How long since you last had her in the air?" she asked, her voice steady. "Hours before she dropped me here," he admitted. "Hydraulics failed. Instruments went wild. I had to put her down before I lost complete control." Maria crouched beside the belly of the helicopter and opened her case of tools. Inside were pliers, wrenches, screwdrivers, all worn but well maintained, each wrapped carefully in cloth. Richard felt a strange awe watching her work. It was as though time folded back and he was watching a younger version of her, alive in the rhythm of machinery, coaxing steel and wire to obey. She handed him a wrench without looking and he took it automatically, falling into the old dance of maintenance and repair. Hours slipped away in that ravine as they traced wires, replaced seals with makeshift patches from materials she had carried, cleaned out sand from the filters and tightened bolts loosened by the forced landing. She improvised where parts were missing, her knowledge startlingly deep, recalling tricks and field repairs Richard had only ever heard whispered in stories. Sweat streaked their foreheads, the sun blazed overhead, but neither slowed. For the first time since meeting her, Richard felt the full weight of what she had once been, more than a medic, more than a caretaker. She was a warrior's support, a lifeline in the desert of war, and the Apache seemed to respond to her touch as if recognizing one of its own. By mid-afternoon, when the sun began to tilt westward, they climbed into the cockpit. Richard settled into the pilot's seat, Maria beside him, her hands surprisingly sure on the co-pilot's controls. He turned the ignition, holding his breath as the machine groaned, sputtered, and then coughed to life. The rotors creaked, the instruments flickered, and then the sound built into a steady roar, the kind of noise that shook dust from the canyon walls. Richard's heart surged with relief, but when he looked at Maria, her face was unreadable, her eyes distant. "She'll fly," she said quietly, almost reluctantly. "But not far. The patchwork will hold for now, but it's not a long-term fix. You'll need a base, real supplies, or she'll betray you again." Richard nodded, though his gaze lingered on her. There was more in her silence, something deeper than caution. He sensed that repairing the helicopter was not just about getting him home, it was about drawing her back into the world she had abandoned. For a fleeting moment, as the rotors churned above them and the desert shook with power, he thought he saw in her eyes a fire long extinguished rekindle itself. But then she pulled her hand back, resting it in her lap, and the light dimmed again. He shut the engine down, letting the rotors wind to silence, and the canyon fell still. The two of them sat in the cockpit for a long while, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down heavier than the desert heat. Richard wanted to tell her that the regiment would remember her if they knew, that the men and women serving now would honor her if her story was told. But Maria turned her head toward him, her expression steady, and said, "Not all stories are meant to be told, Captain. Some are meant to live quietly so those who carry them can finally rest." He swallowed hard, realizing then that the patch on her sleeve was not a boast or a secret. It was a scar, one she carried openly only in the solitude of the desert. And yet, as they climbed down from the Apache and packed away the tools, he could not shake the feeling that fate had not brought them together for silence. Something in the way the desert wind shifted, something in the way her eyes lingered on the horizon, told him her story was not finished. And neither was his. The desert night came quickly after their work on the Apache, the horizon swallowing the last streaks of orange until the sky was a deep indigo spattered with stars sharp as glass, and Richard found himself sitting outside Maria's small clay-brick home, listening to the hum of crickets and the distant cry of coyotes. The air had cooled, but the weight of the day still pressed against his skin, the sweat and dust clinging like another layer of clothing. Inside, Maria moved quietly, placing away her tools and setting a pot over the fire, her movements steady and deliberate, her silence saying more than words could. Richard's mind, however, refused to be still. Every moment with her sharpened the paradox. She had fled from the regiment, erased herself from its story, and yet here she was, carrying the insignia like a living relic, keeping the knowledge of the Apache alive in her bones. It unsettled him, but it also pulled him toward her, like a compass needle refusing to point elsewhere. He leaned against the adobe wall, staring at the sky, when a low rumble carried across the desert, faint at first but unmistakable to a pilot's ears, the drone of an engine, distant but approaching. He straightened instantly, every nerve awake, his hand going to the sidearm holstered at his hip. Maria emerged from the doorway, her expression shifting as if she had heard the sound too, though she showed no alarm, only a tight resolve. Richard stepped into the open, scanning the dark ridgelines until headlights flared briefly against a rise before vanishing into the canyon's shadow. A vehicle was out here, where no road officially led, no towns nearby for hundreds of miles. His training told him possibilities: smugglers, scavengers, or worse, men who made the desert their hunting ground. "Stay inside," he whispered, but Maria shook her head, her voice calm as she said, "This is not the first time." That answer sent a chill through him. She walked past him out into the darkness and he followed, unwilling to let her face danger alone. They crouched behind a cluster of rocks as the sound grew louder, dust rising in the moonlight until a pair of trucks crept into view, their engines growling, their bodies scarred with rust and paint stripped by sun. Men stood in the beds, rifles slung across their shoulders, their laughter carrying through the canyon like broken glass. Richard tensed, instinct kicking in, but Maria placed a hand on his arm, a surprising firmness in her touch. "They come for me sometimes," she murmured, her eyes fixed on the trucks. "Not me exactly, what they think I have. Medicine, knowledge, supplies. They think I am a healer for hire or a relic hoarding secrets." Richard's jaw tightened. "And you let them?" "I let them leave alive," she said simply, and there was something in her tone that froze him, a steel that reminded him she was not defenseless. The trucks rolled to a halt near her home, engines idling and men spilled out, their boots crunching against the dirt, their voices coarse with drink and bravado. Richard counted at least 6, maybe more hidden in the shadows. He gripped his sidearm, prepared to act, but Maria's hand still pressed against him, steady as stone. "Not yet," she whispered. The leader of the group, a broad man with a scar cutting down his cheek, called out in Spanish-accented English, demanding that she come out, that she bring what she had promised last time. Richard frowned, realizing this was not a random raid but a routine, an arrangement forced upon her. To his shock, Maria stepped from behind the rocks and into the moonlight, her shoulders squared, her posture calm. She carried nothing but a lantern in her hand, its glow painting her face with an eerie resolve. The men jeered, but they fell quieter as she approached, something in her presence silencing their bravado. Richard crouched lower, his heart pounding, ready to intervene if one raised a weapon, but none did. Maria set the lantern on the ground and spoke with a voice that carried without shouting, telling them she had nothing new for them, that the desert had given her little since they last came, that if they wished to take something, they would find only dust and silence. The scarred man laughed, stepping closer, his hand brushing the rifle slung at his side, but Maria did not flinch. She lifted her sleeve deliberately, revealing the patch on her arm, and in the lantern's glow the insignia gleamed. Richard's breath caught. He had seen what that patch meant to soldiers, but what did it mean to men like these? The answer came in their sudden hush. The leader's expression faltered, his bravado dimming, his eyes narrowing at the emblem. "I know that sign," he muttered, uncertainty creeping into his voice. One of his men shifted uneasily, whispering something Richard couldn't hear. Maria stood tall, her face unreadable, and for the first time Richard understood that the patch was more than memory, it was armor, a warning, a shadow of power these men still feared. She told them to leave, her voice as calm as the desert wind, and for a long moment no one moved. Then with a grunt, the leader spat into the dirt, signaled his men, and they climbed back into their trucks. Engines roared, tires kicked sand, and the convoy rolled away, swallowed by darkness, leaving only dust and silence behind. Richard rose from cover, stunned, adrenaline still coursing through him. He hurried to her side, demanding to know how the patch alone had been enough to send armed men away. Maria bent to lift the lantern, her hand steady, her voice quiet. "Because symbols carry ghosts, Captain. Some men fear bullets, others fear memories. The right patch tells them I am not alone even out here." Richard stared at her, awe and unease mixing in his chest. She had faced down 6 armed men without lifting a weapon, using nothing but the weight of a forgotten insignia. It shook him in ways battle never had. As they returned to the house, he could not stop replaying the moment in his mind, the way the leader's eyes had flicked to the patch, the sudden hesitation, the surrender of violence. He realized then that Maria's exile was not just self-imposed, it was also enforced by the myth she carried. She was not a hermit hiding in the desert, she was a sentinel, guarding something larger than herself, and men feared her because of what she represented. Inside, she placed the lantern down, poured herself a cup of water, and finally looked at him. "Now you see why I remain here," she said. "The regiment forgot me, but the world has not. My silence is my weapon. My solitude is my shield." Richard felt his throat tighten, the words catching. He wanted to argue, to tell her she deserved more than shadows, that her story deserved to be told, but as he looked into her eyes, he realized the desert had given her something he could not offer: control, power on her own terms. Still, something in him stirred restlessly, a conviction that this was not where her story should end. He thought of his own regiment, his brothers and sisters still flying, still bleeding in distant skies. He thought of the patch on her sleeve and what it would mean to them to know she still lived, still carried their legacy. But he also thought of the trucks fading into the night, the men who had walked away because of her silence, and he wondered if perhaps her way was wiser than his. Outside, the desert stretched endless, stars wheeling overhead, and he realized they stood at a crossroads. One path leading back to his base, his duty, his war, the other leading deeper into the silence Maria had chosen. And in that silence, the question burned brighter than the stars. Which road was truly survival and which was surrender? The following morning carried with it a silence heavier than the desert heat, the kind of silence that seemed to press against the skin and seep into the bones, and Richard woke with the memory of the night's confrontation replaying in his head like a mission debrief he could not escape. Maria was already awake, seated at the table with her patch visible on her sleeve, her face unreadable as she slowly polished a metal canteen, as though the task itself kept her anchored in the present. Richard studied her, trying to reconcile the image of the woman who had faced down armed men with nothing but her voice and the weight of an insignia with the quiet caretaker who had bandaged his arm and fed him. He realized then that Maria was not 2 different people but both at once. A soldier who had survived battles by refusing to flinch and a woman who had chosen exile to carry that survival in her own way. He drank from the cup of bitter coffee she set in front of him, but his thoughts churned restless. The Apache lay waiting in the ravine, patched together just enough to carry him back to his unit, back to the regiment that still counted on him. Duty pulled at him like a tether wrapped tight around his chest, reminding him of his oaths, of the voices of his brothers and sisters who might even now be in the air, depending on him. But another pull, softer yet strangely heavier, anchored him to the clay walls of Maria's home and to the shadow she carried in her silence. She had lived the life he was still living, and she had chosen to walk away, not because she lacked courage but because she had seen where the endless cycle led. Richard set his cup down and finally spoke, his voice quieter than he intended. "I should go. My people will be looking for me. They'll think I'm dead." Maria looked up at him, her eyes calm but sharp, as if she could see through the layers of his words into the weight beneath. "Yes," she said simply. "They need you. But the question is, do you still need them?" The bluntness of it hit him like rotor wash, unexpected and forceful. He wanted to answer immediately, to affirm his loyalty without hesitation, but the truth caught in his throat. He needed the regiment, yes, but not in the same way he had once believed. He thought of the patch on her sleeve, of the ghost she carried, and realized that his need for them was tied less to duty and more to fear. Fear of being alone, fear of being forgotten, fear of vanishing into the silence Maria had embraced. He tried to change the subject, asking her what she would do now that the men in the trucks had seen her again, but she shook her head. "They come and go. Fear keeps them away more than any rifle. It is enough." Richard frowned, unease gnawing at him. "But one day fear won't be enough. One day they'll test you." Her gaze hardened, though her tone remained steady. "Then they will learn what silence can do." He wanted to argue, but her certainty stilled him. Instead, he found himself asking the question that had lingered since the night he arrived. "Why me? Why now? If you've been hiding here all this time, why let me in? Why show me the patch? Why help me with the Apache?" For a long moment she did not answer. She looked past him, through the doorway to the desert horizon where the sun was rising in gold fire, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of something long buried. "Because you are the kind of soldier I once was. Tired, carrying more than you admit, already standing with one foot in silence. You were not brought to my door by accident, Captain. The desert brings who it chooses." Her words unsettled him, as if she had peeled back his armor without effort. He wanted to deny it, to claim he was strong, committed, unbroken, but deep inside he knew she was right. He had been fraying long before the Apache failed, hiding his exhaustion behind discipline, burying his doubts under the regiment's creed. Meeting her had cracked that shield wide open. He stood abruptly, pacing the room, trying to reclaim the rhythm of command in his own voice. "I can't just stay here. They'll send a search team. They'll find the Apache. If I don't return, if I don't answer, they'll assume I'm lost or worse. That's not fair to them." Maria nodded slowly, still calm. "Then you must decide what story you want them to believe. The living pilot who came back from the desert, or the one who never returned?" Richard turned to her sharply, anger flashing despite himself. "I'm not ready to be a ghost." But even as he said it, he felt the doubt sink deeper, because wasn't that exactly what she had done? She had become a ghost in plain sight, a living memory haunting the edge of the desert, feared and respected yet unseen by the world. And part of him wondered if she wasn't freer for it. The rest of the day passed in tense silence, broken only by small exchanges of necessity, water drawn, food prepared, tools put away. As dusk returned, Richard sat alone outside, staring at the silhouette of the Apache in the ravine, the machine that could carry him away or strand him forever. Maria joined him, sitting in the dirt with her knees drawn up, her patch catching the last of the light. "When I left," she said suddenly, her voice low, "I thought I would be forgotten. But the truth is, I never left at all. The regiment lives in me whether I wear the uniform or not. That is the burden. You cannot set it down, you can only decide where to carry it." Richard swallowed hard, the truth of her words pressing into him like the desert heat. He knew then that leaving meant carrying the ghosts back into the sky, and staying meant carrying them into silence. Neither choice would free him, but one would bind him to the world and the other would bind him to her. He closed his eyes, the weight of decision pressing heavier than any mission he had flown, and when he opened them again, the desert stars were burning like witnesses, waiting for his answer. The air inside the cabin seemed to thicken with a silence that weighed more heavily than words ever could. Michael sat stiff in the wooden chair by the window, his bruised shoulder throbbing but his mind far away from the physical pain. His eyes kept returning to the patch he had glimpsed on her jacket earlier, the symbol burned into his memory like a scar. The edges of his thoughts were jagged, cutting into him with questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. Sarah, the woman who had tended to his wounds, who had risked her own standing in the Apache community to hide him, carried a mark of the very same unit that had once caused devastation in this land. It was impossible. It was unthinkable. And yet he had seen it with his own eyes. Sarah moved quietly across the room, setting down a clay bowl of herbs near the fire, her hands steady though her breath came slower than before. She had seen his stare, felt the way the silence between them had shifted. Her back remained turned for a moment longer than natural, as if she were summoning the courage to face him. Finally she turned, her dark eyes locking onto his with a steadiness that told him she was not afraid. "You saw it," she said simply, her voice stripped of any attempt to soften the reality. Michael's jaw tightened. "That patch. I know it. My father spoke of it long ago. That insignia doesn't belong here, not on you." His voice was low, almost hoarse, as if saying the words themselves took more strength than he had left. Sarah stepped closer, her footsteps soundless against the worn floor. "It does not belong here," she admitted. "But it belongs to me. And there is a story behind it, one you will hear whether you want to or not. Because you cannot leave this place carrying half a truth. The world has enough men carrying half-truths, and it has brought nothing but ruin." Her words struck deep, though Michael gave no outward sign. His mind swirled with images of his father, of the squadron insignia that had been both pride and grief in their family's history. He thought of the endless years of conflict between settlers, soldiers, and native tribes, of the betrayals, the violence, and the fragile truces that never held. What could possibly link this woman, a healer in a remote Apache settlement, to that symbol? Sarah sat down opposite him, the firelight throwing long shadows across her face. She looked older in that moment, not by years but by weight, the kind of burden that carved itself into the soul. "My mother," she began, "was not from this place. She was white. She came here decades ago, not as a conqueror or a settler, but as a woman running from the ashes of her own life. She carried with her only a few belongings, one of them that patch sewn onto her jacket. She told me it was a reminder of both shame and strength. Shame because it tied her to men who had taken much from these lands. Strength because she chose to break from them, to live differently, to give her life to healing instead of destruction." Michael's heart hammered in his chest. "Your mother?" He could barely form the words. "Then that patch wasn't yours, it was hers?" Sarah nodded slowly. "Yes. She kept it all her life, even when it would have been safer to cast it into the fire. She said burning it would be too easy. Keeping it was her way of remembering, of never allowing herself to forget what men in uniforms had done, what she had once been connected to. When she died, it passed to me. And though I did not fight in your wars, though I did not wear the uniform, the burden of memory fell to me all the same." Michael leaned forward, his face pale, as the weight of her story sank in. "So you wear it not as a soldier but as a reminder? As a curse?" Sarah's lips curved into the faintest shadow of a smile. "As a reminder, yes. But not a curse. My people teach that every object holds power, not in the thing itself but in the story it carries. That patch carries the story of violence but also of choice. My mother chose a different path and so did I. That is why you are alive, Michael. Because when I found you broken in the forest, I chose to heal, not to hate." The fire cracked loudly in the hearth, filling the silence that followed. Michael rubbed a hand across his face, torn between disbelief and a growing, reluctant respect. His training told him to distrust, to question every motive. Yet nothing in Sarah's voice rang false. If anything, her honesty cut deeper than any lie ever could. "You could have left me there," he admitted finally, his voice quieter now. "You could have let the land finish what the crash started." "I could have," she said. "But then I would be no different than the men who left scars on this land. Healing you was not a gift. It was a duty, to myself, to my people, and even to my mother's memory." Michael swallowed hard, his throat dry. His mind replayed the moment he first saw the patch, the jolt of fear and anger it had sparked. Yet now that same patch seemed transformed, no longer a symbol of dominance but of defiance, of a woman choosing to carry a painful legacy in order to reshape it. Outside, the wind howled against the cabin, carrying with it the distant echo of voices. Michael stiffened, his soldier's instincts snapping to life. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Sarah had already risen to her feet, her eyes narrowing. "Yes. Riders." She crossed swiftly to the window, pulling back the edge of a cloth curtain just enough to see. Her jaw tightened. "It is not my people. These are soldiers." Michael's blood ran cold. "They must have tracked the crash site. They're searching for me." He tried to push himself to his feet, but the wound in his side sent a lightning bolt of pain through his body. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself upright with sheer will. "I can't let them find this place. If they see you with me, they'll think you've been aiding the enemy." Sarah turned sharply, her hand pressing firmly against his chest to push him back down. "You will not move," she ordered. You will only collapse again and then you will be useless to us both. Let me think. The command in her voice startled him, but he obeyed, slumping back into the chair. His heart pounded as the sound of horses grew closer, boots crunching against the hard ground outside. Sarah grabbed the jacket, the one with the patch, and shoved it deep into a wooden chest by the bed. She pulled a blanket over Michael, hiding the bandages as best she could. Then she grabbed a small bundle of herbs and smeared some across her hands, so the strong, pungent smell would fill the room. Moments later, the door banged open. 2 soldiers stepped inside, rifles slung over their shoulders, their eyes sweeping the room. Behind them stood a third, older and sterner, his face weathered by years of command. Michael's breath caught. He recognized the insignia on the officer's coat. It was the same squadron patch. The very same. Sarah stood tall, unflinching, her gaze steady. "What do you want?" she demanded in her calm, even tone. The officer's eyes narrowed as he scanned the cabin. "We're looking for a downed pilot. He crashed nearby. Some say an Apache woman might have dragged him off before we could get to him. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" His voice carried the arrogance of authority, but there was something sharper beneath it, suspicion. Sarah shook her head. "The only man in this cabin is my father, who has been dead for 10 winters. You may search if you think my words are not enough." The officer studied her for a long moment, then his gaze fell on the chest near the bed. Sarah's breath caught, though she did not move. Slowly he strode toward it, his boots thudding against the wooden floor. He laid a hand on the lid. Michael's muscles tensed under the blanket, every nerve in his body screaming at him to act. The patch was inside. If the officer saw it, everything would unravel. Sarah, sensing his tension, stepped forward, her tone sharp and cutting. "That chest holds the belongings of my dead mother. Out of respect for the dead, you will not touch it." The officer paused, his eyes flicking to hers. For a heartbeat, the room was a taut wire ready to snap. Then, with a small, cold smile, he removed his hand from the chest. "Very well. But if I find out you've lied to me, woman, I will burn this place to the ground." He turned, gesturing to his men, and within moments they were gone, the sound of hooves fading into the distance. Michael let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Sarah stood still, her shoulders rigid, her hands trembling ever so slightly. She turned to him, her face pale but composed. "They will come back," she said quietly. "And next time they may not leave so easily." Michael met her gaze, his voice low and resolute. "Then we'll be ready. Together." The campfire burned low that night, sending curls of smoke into the clear desert sky. David lay on his side near the fire, his ribs still wrapped in cloth that smelled faintly of herbs and smoke. His eyes were half shut, not from exhaustion this time, but from something more complicated. He was thinking, remembering, replaying the moment when he had seen her patch, something so small, yet it had shattered his assumptions and left him restless. A simple woman, living in the desert, tending to him with quiet strength, yet carrying the mark of an Apache clan, a patch stitched carefully into her clothing. He had thought he was the one with secrets, the soldier downed in enemy land, but now he understood that the woman herself was a mystery. Maya sat across from him, sharpening a small knife by the fire. Her movements were calm, methodical, almost ceremonial. The firelight caught her face, bringing out the sharpness of her cheekbones, the dark intensity in her eyes. She did not speak, but she knew he was watching her. Every so often, she lifted her gaze and met his, as though daring him to ask what he wanted to ask. But David remained silent. He had seen enough combat to know that silence could sometimes be more revealing than words. At last, when the blade gleamed, she set it aside and leaned forward, feeding another stick into the fire. "You keep staring," she said, her voice low, carrying across the crackle of burning wood. "Do you want to ask, soldier?" David exhaled slowly, shifting against the ground. His side ached, but he ignored it. "That patch," he said finally. "I know what it means. That's not just a piece of fabric. It's a mark of belonging. The men I fought against, they carried signs too. Different tribes, different factions. That patch, it wasn't supposed to be here." Her expression didn't change much, but her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. She looked at him for a long time, long enough that he wondered if she would ignore the question entirely. Then, with deliberate patience, she spoke. "Not everything belongs to war, David. Some marks are older than your soldiers, older than your flags, older than your enemies. This patch is not what you think." He pushed himself up to sit, wincing. "Then tell me what it is. Because where I come from, patches like that identify allies and enemies. They tell us who we can trust and who we can't. And when I saw yours, I froze. Because I realized I don't know which one you are. The words hung in the air, heavy as stone. Maya stared at him, the flames reflecting in her eyes. She did not look offended, she looked weary as though she had carried this question, this suspicion for far too long. Finally, she reached for the patch, running her fingers across the faded threads. This belonged to my brother, she said, her voice softening. He fought in a war that was not his, many years ago. When he did not return, all I had left was this. I wear it not as a soldier but as a sister who remembers. It is not a mark of loyalty. It is a mark of grief. David blinked, the tension in his chest easing just slightly. He wanted to believe her, every part of her tone felt real, honest, but his training made him cautious. Lies could sound like truth and truth could look like deception. Still, there was something in her eyes, something raw that he couldn't ignore. So you're not with them? He asked. She shook her head. No. I belong to no army. I belong to the land, the sky, the wind. I live here because here I am free. I saved you because you were bleeding, not because of who you fight for. If that is not enough, then perhaps you should have died in the sand. Her words cut sharper than her knife and David flinched. But then, slowly he nodded. You're right. I owe you more than suspicion. I owe you my life. The silence after that was different, heavier but not hostile. The fire crackled, the desert breathed around them, and somewhere far in the distance, a coyote called. David closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over him. He thought of his own past, his own brother, the one he had buried years ago. The ache of memory tightened his chest. Perhaps, he thought, grief was the one language that needed no translation. Days passed and David grew stronger. His wounds closed, though his ribs remained tender. Maya taught him how to walk without straining, how to breathe with the pain until it dulled.